I just flew in last night from Ireland, so probably a bit jet-lagged, and I'll do my best to keep this engaging. So Jimmy's just raised the whole audience right up, and I'm going to bring it back down now. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. At my talk, I'll just go ahead while the slides are waiting. Oh, I can't see them here. All right, my talk is about the importance of adipose tissue functionality, because a lot of us know that there's a huge amount of action going on in the liver in insulin resistance and diabetes and some of the biggest diseases in the world. But a few months ago, I did a lot of work with Gábor Erdosi, a Hungarian molecular biologist and a fantastic guy. And we went through many papers to try and work out what's going on in the adipose. And it turns out the adipose, or fat tissue, is really important. And it's one of the first things to go when you head on the road to chronic disease. So I'm going to bring you through some of that. I did do a talk at Physicians for Ancestral Health in much greater depth than this one, so any masochists out there, you can find it on YouTube. But today I'll keep it a little higher level. So 3 parts: the hyperinsulin, insulin resistance iceberg out there. It's huge. We estimate 60% of adult Americans are essentially insulin resistant diabetic. Part 2 then will go through the adipose behaving badly and all the kind of little mechanisms that go on there that lead to your fall. And then we'll get to the positive bit, the uplift at the end, reaching safety, because you can sort it out. So the iceberg first, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Joseph Kraft, and he was a pathologist and doctor of nuclear medicine who did incredible work in the 60s and 70s with the earliest insulin immunoassays. And basically, he tested around 15,000 people with a full 5-hour insulin tolerance test with glucose tolerance. And what he found was that you can see a small amount, well, around 25% of his walk-in patients got pattern 1 healthy euinsulinemia. And here they had a nice gentle rise of insulin after drinking the glucose, and it tailed off quickly. And that's non-diabetic. But he found that around 75% of his various patients had hyperinsulinemia, and he called it diabetes in situ, because they were essentially diabetic from all his research and his thousands of autopsies, but they would pass a fasting glucose test, 90% of them. So the test they use for diabetes screening, fasting glucose, is very ineffective. He knew there were way more people out there with essential diabetes. And there was a quick version you could do 2 hours after drinking glucose. If your insulin is below 30, you're likely fine. Above 40, you're not. So that's the quick test. But he also made a statement from all his research, and he said those with cardiovascular disease not identified with diabetes are simply undiagnosed. That's a powerful statement. That's saying that essentially most cardiovascular disease victims are diabetic, and that's what's driving it. So let's have a look and see, 30 years after he stated this, was he maybe correct? And here is the EuroAspire study, 2015 in Europe. And it looked at around 7,000 random cardiovascular victims, ages 18 to 80, 24 countries. So it's a massive sample, and it's going to tell you what's going on with CVD. When they checked, around a third of the guys were already diagnosed diabetics, so they took those out, right? But that'll tell you something. They looked at the non-diabetics, people who were apparently not diabetic, and checked their glucose metrics. Whereupon they found that a third of those guys were full diabetics. They found a third more were high risk for diabetes, which is diabetic. No question about it, right? And the remaining few, or well, third, were they didn't have their insulin tested. So as we just said with Kraft, you need to test insulin to find diabetes. So if you roll the figures all together, 81% were essentially diabetic of all the cardiovascular victims in Europe, and the other 19% weren't properly tested. So I guess we can say, Joe, if he wasn't 100% correct, he was pretty damn close, right? So this is a huge issue. So I'm not going to go through the real detailed insulin stuff, but I will show you briefly some insulin pathways because it explains the story later on. On the left, you see you have the first canonical pathway of insulin's action, and it's in red. And that pathway continues to respond to insulin even when you become insulin resistant, which is not a good thing for reasons I won't get into. But the blue pathway is the one that becomes resistant. It's the PI3 kinase pathway, and that does a huge amount of important work in your body, but it becomes resistant when you become hyperinsulinemic. And I'm just going to show you a study to illustrate. In this study, they had people with no diabetic parents, no family history, and they had people who had both parents type 2 diabetic. But otherwise, their bloods were all matched. They were all healthy. They had no concerning bloods. So they were very well matched. But when they looked in at the family history guys with genetic testing of that pathway I mentioned, they were highly suppressed. So by going in and doing the genetic testing, you could see the guys with the family history were already insulin resistant and already heading for the rocks, which is quite interesting. But what if we looked at those guys with a Kraft test that I described to you, a simple 2-hour insulin? What would it look like? And what they found in the study was all the family history guys failed at over 40 at the 2 hours, and all the control guys with no family history passed. So it shows you the power of that test to be able to weed out people with a family history who are heading for diabetes long before their bloods look bad. I'll show one study that was very similar, but it began to explain why. And here the parents, guys with diabetic parents, they found that the really remarkable thing about them, and these guys were only in their 30s, all their bloods looked reasonably good, right? The remarkable thing was their adipocytes, or their fat cells size, was larger. And the larger it was, that's what predicted the HOMA that Jimmy mentioned, and the insulin, and all the other problems, directly tracked with the adipocyte cell size. And here they call it out. Hypertrophy, which is adipose cells being bigger than they should be, inflammation and fibrosis characterize the adipose tissue of healthy non-obese subjects. These were non-obese guys, okay? So we'll go on to adipose behaving badly now and talk a bit about the fat. And I have 3 phases, they're not in order particularly. The adipose tissue falls first. So here you see the pathway I talked about, and that triggers GLUT4 translocation to the cell membrane of your adipose tissue to take up glucose. And this is a very important process, not to mop up glucose, but to cause many other important signaling things to happen. So I'll show you a study. It looks a bit complicated, but I'll explain it. On the top left, we have adipose glucose take-up, which is very important to be high. And you can see there in this mouse experiment, the bar is high. It's good. To the right is liver glucose production. You want that to be low, and indeed it's low in these mice who are fed standard chow. And then the muscle and body glucose disposal is very important for being able to use glucose for energy and not have it build up in the blood. So you can see the mice here on control chow all look good at the start, and for the next 12 weeks of this study, they stayed good. So I won't show any more about them. But the mice they fed a high sugar, high fat diet to, at 3 days, they had hyperinsulinemia and they had adipose insulin resistance. So one of the first things to come up when you feed a really bad diet is adipose insulin resistance, your fat tissue. At 1 week, you can see that their adipose glucose take-up collapsed. That small black bar, they were completely deranged, and their liver glucose production shot up at only 1 week. So their liver began to make glucose uncontrollably, right? So they were essentially diabetic at a week. But their muscle and their body glucose disposal hadn't yet been affected. So it started in the adipose, triggering to the liver. At 3 weeks, then the body begins to go, and the muscle and their body use of glucose goes, and you really become diabetic. And at 12 weeks, their adipose tissue was completely inflamed, all of their inflammation markers were going up, and poor little Mousy was heading for trouble. So the message from this is the time base. It's very important in any problem to know what pieces fall first, so you can understand how the whole thing works. I'll show one other thing. Here they got mice and they actually deleted the glucose transport in the adipose tissue that I mentioned. They genetically deleted the ability to do that. So they stopped insulin bringing glucose into adipose. And you can see here it collapsed. It's called KO, or knockout. They knock out a capability. But just in the adipose tissue, they knocked out this capability. And what happened quickly is their liver glycogen synthesis, their whole body glucose uptake, their whole systemic health collapsed just by tweaking their adipose tissue. And this is similar in humans. Humans with lipodystrophy, where they can't make enough fat, healthy fat, they become diabetic, most of them, with certain types of the disease. You must have healthy fat to manage your body. And adipose only takes up a small amount of glucose, so it's not the bad adipose not mopping up large amounts of what's flooding around your blood. It's the signaling. So I'll explain that now. When you take up glucose into your adipose tissue, it actually triggers a series of biochemical processes to create lipids, right? De novo lipogenesis. It creates signaling molecules. And two papers I'll show you now are only 2016. There's more being discovered all the time. So the glucose take-up into your adipose when it's healthy creates a whole load of signaling molecules that travel to your liver and around your body. So when your glucose goes in your fat cells, your whole system is taken out. I'll really briefly run through the whole process now. You've got impaired insulin sensitivity in your adipose tissue, shown in yellow there. That can be driven by hyperinsulinemia itself, driving high insulin, right, with bad foods, genetic tendency, other dietary, and many other factors which I'll touch on at the end. Lots of ways to get into trouble, guys. When that happens and you're insulin resistant in adipose, you cut down your GLUT4 pathways. And when that happens, you slow down and reduce the production of many of the beneficial lipokines and fat signaling molecules I mentioned. This will knock out systemic signaling to your liver and elsewhere in your body, and it will all occur in a bath of elevated insulin. That's why insulin measurement is so important. You will never get into serious trouble and have your insulin really low, generally. It's the one to watch. So the second phase of 3, hypertrophy and inflammation, because the swelling of your adipose cell size as you get into trouble causes much more problems and more glucose problems. And inflammation comes in a little later and really kicks everything to hell. So this study I really like. I think it says so much. They had insulin-sensitive obese people and insulin-resistant. They were all 45 years old, approx. They were all 45 BMI. They're big guys. But on the left, you see the insulin-sensitive obese have great markers. Any doc is going to be happy with those, right? They're actually healthy metabolically. The insulin-resistant obese, however, are a disaster, right? They're a heart attack waiting to happen. I mean, just look at the ratios and everything else. But they went very deep in this study and took samples out of their adipose tissue, right, in their viscera. And what you'll see is the insulin-sensitive, first thing, they look different. They have more folds of external fat, whereas the insulin-resistant tend to have more visceral fat, okay? And the micrographs on the bottom you'll see, on the left you see the cell size of the insulin-sensitive big guys is actually small and healthy. But the cell size of the insulin-resistant is much, much bigger, and these are on the same scale. And all the dark color you see, that's macrophage, that's immune system components in their adipose tissue and inflammation. And it can make up to half of the weight of their adipose. It's incredible. And once that starts, you're in real trouble. So you have sick fat and safe fat, as Jimmy mentioned. It's a huge distinction. And one of the most amazing things they got, because in human experiments it's hard to get like really crisp data, but they took 2 measurements which were the amount of immune reaction in your adipose tissue and your macrophage, inflammation, and your serum adiponectin, which is a hormone made by your adipose tissue, and you have more of it when you're healthy. And with just those 2 figures, they could predict 98% of where anyone would lie on the line, which is extraordinary. And it shows you the crucial nature of the adipose tissue health. One other study on non-obese humans, same thing occurs, the TOFIs, as you've all heard about. It is not obesity per se, but rather metabolic dysfunction in adipose tissue that's associated with systemic insulin resistance and MET-sin and the heart attacks that come from it. So I'm not going to go through the inflammatory pathways. I'm going to spare you that, but you can trust me, we have many, many papers. These have been worked out in the past decade, and they all make sense. Your immune system tries to help, but it causes things to become worse. And again, I'll remind you, always accompanied by elevated insulin. That's the marker, okay? So phase 3, and this is a tricky one, so we'll see how it goes. I love it. I call it the VLDL ApoB merry-go-round. And this happens when you eat the wrong foods and you go into a bad place. Here they had slim people and overweight people, but they all had good bloods. So they purposely picked overweight people whose bloods looked okay in the doctor's office, and they had slim people. There were some differences, but they both looked healthy. And what they saw, they gave them 3 meals, all the same meals, spread over 10 hours, and they tracked all of their blood fat, their adipose fat, the meal fat, with radio labels, isotopes. This is a very exotic study. They tracked all the fat molecules and where they went. That's why it's amazing. But you'll see that the heavy guys, even after each meal, their glucose doesn't spike up higher than the slim guys. So they still look good, even post-meal glucose. But look at their post-meal insulins and their post-meal triglycerides, right? Shocking spikes. So again, you got to watch the birdie. It's the insulin and triglyceride after you've had a meal that'll really show you if you have problems. Elevated insulin again. The very interesting part of this was they tracked the fat from the meals and where it went for both sets of people. You'll see here the slim guys who have a small amount of body fat, they actually took up nearly all of the fat from the meals into their adipose. And that's the way it should work, and you release it later when you're not eating. It's a battery system. But the fat guys with much more fat cells, right, only took less than half of the meal fat into their adipose. And this is dysfunctional. This is really crazy, right? So what happened? The rest of the meal fat. Well, they tracked it with radio labels, and it headed off to the liver and went into the liver, right? Which is not something you want to happen, because that's going to drive fatty liver and ectopic fat in your pancreas and in other places. They tracked further, and they saw that the fat was then exported out into VLDL. Are you guys maybe familiar? Your VLDL, your LDL particles, your ApoB, right? This is one of the big ways you can rack it up, by pumping out these particles to clear the fat that's been wrongly put in the liver. And when they tracked it on, they found out that the big guy's adipose tissue was spending its time trying to mop up the fat from these VLDLs, right? And then it couldn't take as much from the meal. So this is crazy, and these guys didn't even have really bad bloods, right? They were early stage. And we call that the merry-go-round, because it's insane. And you can only measure it with postprandial insulin or triglyceride generally. And as I say, that's one of the reasons ApoB is a risk factor and goes up, is this kind of thing happening, and your HDL going down through different mechanisms. I'll remind again, at the point of being boring, hyperinsulin. You're always going to see that. So I went through 3 levels of adipose tissue dysfunction. We went through the early stage where the glucose transport fails and the systemic signaling. We went through the hypertrophy and inflammation stage where things get a lot worse. And we went through the VLDL ApoB merry-go-round just now when things are really getting out of whack. But what's the end game? How do you get into the end game and finally get your type 2 diabetes diagnosis 20 years after you should have got it, if people were measuring the right things? Well, here's how it happens. You get complete adipose brake failure. And this can be slim guys with bad adipose, or it can be heavy guys. Like Jimmy said, it's no respecter of BMI, right? It's the health of your adipose tissue. In summary, what I described earlier, the macrophage, lipolysis from immune attack, and also your insulin resistance in your adipose tissue will allow more triglyceride to escape from your adipose tissue, free fatty acids and glycerol, and that'll head off to your liver. When it gets into your liver, like I showed you with the merry-go-round, it'll get converted into other substrates and packaged and sent back out, racking up your VLDL ApoB, right, in the merry-go-round. The free fatty acids that are being released inappropriately also head to the muscle, and excess of those in the muscle cause further muscle insulin resistance, ectopic fat in the muscle, and they make the muscle insulin resistant. Like I showed you at 3 weeks with the mouse experiment, the muscle happens a little later. The glycerol that's being inappropriately released from your adipose heads to the liver also, and it's a substrate, a powerful one, to drive gluconeogenesis. And because you're insulin resistant now, you're not going to be able to stop your liver making glucose from these substrates. So you're going to start pumping out glucose into your bloodstream. This is very near the end. And all that glucose has nowhere to go because your muscle's locked out, it's insulin resistant, your liver's making it uncontrollably. And eventually, when you're flooded with insulin in the very late stage, your pancreas is wearing an insulin helmet, right? And at this stage, you've just screwed it up. It's going to start failing, and its beta cells will fail under this onslaught of demand for insulin. Then you will get brake failure in your fat tissue, final brake failure, and free fatty acids and glycerol will flood out. And at that stage, it's game over. And you'll finally get your diabetes diagnosis probably 20 years after it could have been picked up with postprandial glucoses and insulins, which is a shame because the damage is starting long before your blood glucose goes out of whack. So we'll wrap up now with the good news. And we'll take away some of the complexity and we'll talk about solutions. So, people like that? Yeah? You didn't like the other, no? Okay. Good news, reaching safety, and you can. Vast majority of people in this state can regress and reach safety. So we're all on a human chronic disease spectrum, and it's best measured by hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. And these two things are two sides of a coin. Dr. Kraft said hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, they are not combatants, they are one and the same. So you always have to treat the two as a pair, right? If you're insulin resistant with very low insulin levels, that can be okay, that's a physiologic state. But when the two are together, that's what I'm talking about. On the bottom left, we've got truly non-diabetic Kraft passers, eubinsulinemia, really low insulin. The ancestral peoples, they all wonder, why did they live to 100? The ones who aren't eaten by tigers or whatever. And the reason is their insulin is on the floor and their leptin and all their adipose signaling is pristine, right? And there's different ways to get there, but they get there. On the top right, you've got wheels off the wagon, full-blown diabetes, which is a metabolic mess. And I kind of touched on it in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Every control system basically has the chains cut, and it's out of control. And that's the worst place to be, obviously. You're going to find on the bottom left, you've got the good health, the vitality, the productivity, the mental acuity, the joie de vivre, you know? You've got the quality of life down the bottom left. This is worth fighting for. Right? And up in the top right, you're going to overwhelmingly see most of the cancers, strokes, MIs, heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes. All the bad things will mostly be up towards the right. No mystery here. I'd say that a third of adult Americans are probably in the truly eubinsulinemic, perfectly non-diabetic. That's what myself and Dr. Jeffrey Gerber reckon. And they can be slim or they can actually be very heavy, as Jimmy referred to. You know, if you can have metabolic health and be quite large. In the middle, there's around another third who are pre-diabetic hyperinsulinemic, and they're going to be exposed to much higher risk for chronic disease. And they can be slim-looking or fat-looking either. And at the top right, you've got the really affected guys, you know, who are super high insulin, profoundly diabetic type 2, and they've got huge risk. And again, you can be a slim toffee and be up there. My supporter, David Bobbitt, an Irish entrepreneur, he was running 4 times a week. He was slim as a whippet. He was in excellent health, passed all the executive medical health tests. And then he got a calcification score, and it was 1,000. He had 3 blocked arteries. And a few weeks later, they found out he was profoundly diabetic. And none of his blood measures showed, because they never looked at postprandial glucose or insulin, right? So it's no respecter of body weight. Where are you? And that's the big question, right? We're all selfish. We want to know where we are. What's our odds? Well, the best way to find out where you actually have been, if you're middle-aged in your life to date, on the spectrum and how bad you've been, is to get a calcification score. It's around $100, $150 in the States. It's a quick scan, and they find the calcium in your coronary arteries. And it doesn't just reflect risk for cardiovascular disease, but it does that amazingly, future disease. It also predicts all-cause mortality, because the calcification is driven by the bad processes I described to you, right? So you might go down with a heart attack, you might go down with a cancer, but you know, the CAC is the ultimate test. Here you see risk factors going from the left to right, not 1, 2, or more than 3 risk factors. And they do predict a higher mortality, you can see that. They're not fantastic at predicting, but they do predict. But going back into the page, all the yellows on the front are 0 calcification score, and all the reds at the back are high, over 400. And you can hopefully see the calcification score is a massively better predictor, and it blows away all the risk factors. So that's the ultimate test to find out where you are in health. But there are many other measures I'm showing to get you down to the bottom left and to track your progress. Postprandial, post-meal are the best for insulin and glucose. Trig over HDL was mentioned earlier, absolutely. Great measure of insulin resistance. GGT and ferritin are two, which I don't know if you get them in the States, but they're really good. And then there's the fat-based hormones, adiponectin and leptin. You want adiponectin high, healthy fat. You want leptin low. So there's quite a few blood measures you can get. But now the fix. How do you fix this? And everyone has a different opinion, but I think most people in this room would be pretty aligned. So myself and Dr. Gerber have the 10 levers, and we have a book coming out in a few months' time, so this is some of the content in it. But basically we see there's 10 key things. The first 3 are elimination levers, and these are ones you don't screw with, right? They're like, can you have a few cigarettes if you're a smoker? No, you can't. You're going to be back on 2 packs a day. It's similar with refined carbs, sugar, vegetable oils, processed food, the bad processed food. If you play with it, it'll drift back into your life. So there, just eliminate them. And you'll feel much better, and you'll get, much nicer food anyway when you jump off that wagon. Of course, low carb, above ground leafy vegetable carb, no processed flash to glucose, absorbable carb. Low carb, healthy carb. Healthy fat, high healthy fat. Now the ideal there would be, the fish, the avocados, and all these kind of classic known healthy fats, but also ancestral fatty foods that are nutrient dense. I will mention on the fat side that there is some evidence that ApoE4 type people, especially ones who had previous diabetes or disease, can be sensitive to some animal fats, cheese and meats, when eaten to excess, and it can drive a certain amount of insulin. So for some subgroup, there may be a sensitivity, but broadly, healthy fats, we know what they are. And high quality protein and moderate. You shouldn't be going really high in protein unless you're building a lot of muscle, which I certainly am not. So I go moderate. Fasting. If you do the high fat diet successfully, and certainly keto, as you'll all know, it enables an exquisite control of your appetite system. It doesn't just magically knock all the weight off you, and you will reach plateaus, but it enables you to control hunger, and it enables you to do meal skipping or fasting. I find that of enormous benefit for myself. I always fast around 24 hours before I go into a major challenge in work or anything like that, because I'm at my best. And it's also got massive health benefits across a range of autophagy and cleaning up old cellular junk, and we know about fasting for cancers becoming established. It's a super thing, but you can only do it properly, I think, if you do the healthy low carb or keto first and get into that, get your appetite under control. Then we have sun, stress, and sleep, our 3 S's. Very important. Not everyone can get them all right. They can really hold you back if you don't get those right. I agree with maximum exposure to sun without burning. It's not just vitamin D. There's a lot of other photo products that are made and a lot of vasodilation and other benefits with sun exposure. So we've been sold a bit of a lie on sun exposure for the last 30, 40 years, but no burning. Stress and sleep, hard to manage, but they make a big difference to your hormonal dynamics, and they can be reasons for plateaus in weight loss. Exercise, stress exercise, I would recommend Dr. Ted Naiman's 15, 20-minute press-ups, push-ups, squats, no problem. You can do it 3 or 4 times a week, push to failure, and you get huge benefits with very little time invested. And supplements, we've got the magnesium, the salts, potassium, and all the things that are important when you're on an ancestral high-fat diet to keep up. If you do that, and if we did this for the whole population, and our authorities and medical world and research world kind of told people these basic 10 rules and said this is generally what you need to aim for, we could move the population back down to ancestral health, I have no doubt, over a period of years. Or we can leave them drifting, as they are increasingly and disgracefully, up into the metabolic mess, metabolic mayhem of diseased adipose tissue and everything that goes with it. So I would just say, look after your adipose, guys. I hope you have found some of the mechanisms a little interesting and some of the solutions. And I leave the last word to our adipose tissue. Thank you.